In 1821, two sisters, Mary and Eliza Herrick of Lancaster County, entered a sleeping state that lasted over 2 years. Town physicians, including Dr. Eliza Tate, documented the girls' sustained pulse and stable respiration. Religious leaders declared it divine punishment. When they awoke, they could describe events that occurred during their slumber. Their medical files disappeared from the Pennsylvania Medical College archives in 1894, coinciding with the fire that destroyed the institution's library. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, autumn 1821, dawn. Mist clings low over the stubbled fields, and the bell of a small meeting house sounds once, twice, and then falls quiet. In a farmhouse at the edge of a lane lined with sycamores, a mother sets down a pewter cup beside a bed and waits for the girl on the pillow to stir. She does not. In the next room, another bed holds another girl with the same still hands and the same slow breath that lifts the coverlet as steady as a metronome. The clock ticks. The girls sleep. Their names are Mary and Eliza Herrick, sisters from a family that plants corn and rye, and keeps a careful ledger of debts paid in butter, wool, and the occasional silver coin. The house is modest, the floors scrubbed, the windows clean enough to reflect the pale of the sky. There is nothing in the room that speaks of supernatural things, unless you count the Bible on the nightstand, and the way the air seems to hold itself very still, as if it too were listening for a sign. In a bound daybook kept by a town physician, there is a neat hand that records the measurements any 19th century medical man would trust: pulse to the minute, respirations to the minute, the warmth of the skin as judged by the back of the hand. Patient Mary H., pulse 64, respiration 18. Patient Eliza H., pulse 65, respiration 19, both unresponsive to stimulus, pupils obedient to light, skin warm. The entry is dated in the fall of 1821, and the doctor signs his name in full: Eliza Tate. Dr. Eliza Tate is not a charlatan. He is a careful man with a reputation for fair fees and a habit of using full sentences when others lean on Latin. He ties his hair back with a black ribbon and reads the Philadelphia journals when he can get them. When the Herrick family sends a boy to his door with a note that says, simply, "The girls will not wake," he takes his bag and goes. He finds them sleeping. He comes back the next day and the next. He sits by each bed. He pricks a finger. And when the girl does not flinch, he notes it. He speaks their names, and when they do not answer, he notes that too. He holds a mirror to their lips and sees the fog of breath. He places a hand on each chest and feels the even rise and fall. He writes, sustained pulse, and stable respiration, and sleeping state. He does not write the more frightening words that his profession would use for other patients, because nothing he knows quite fits what he is seeing. The town notices. At first it is a curiosity, the way any strange thing in a rural county is a curiosity. People passing by the Herrick place slow their wagons. They ask after the girls at the mill. They lower their voices when they mention the name. Within a week, the meeting house is full on a weekday evening, and the minister is speaking in a careful voice about the many ways in which God tests his people. We must examine our hearts, he says. We must consider whether this is a chastening. Another minister, a man with a louder voice and a sharper jaw, says it more plainly the next Sunday. The Lord has set them as a sign. Do not search for science in a matter that belongs to heaven. Mary and Eliza do not wake. The seasons turn. Snow edges the window panes. Spring loosens the creek. Summer leans heavy on the corn. Still, the sisters lie in their separate rooms, breathe, and do not open their eyes. Dr. Tate returns with regularity that would be noble, if it were not also tinged with a private need to understand. He has heard the city men speak of animal magnetism, of strange trances and shared wills, and he mistrusts such talk. He trusts what he can touch. The sisters are alive. The sisters are sleeping. The sisters do not starve. Their mother spoons thin broth against their lips and lets the liquid run in. Their bodies take what they need and reject what they do not. There are no sores on their skin. There is no sign of decay. There is no stink of illness. There is only time. Visitors come. Some are quiet, setting down a loaf of bread and a prayer. Some are not. One woman in a red shawl insists on laying her hand on Mary's forehead and then leaves satisfied, as if she has taken something away with her. A man who has been to Philadelphia to see lectures on the peculiar powers of the mind asks whether he may hold a magnet above Eliza's heart. Dr. Tate says no. The father of the girls turns men out when their questions turn cruel. The mother learns to sleep upright in a chair between the two rooms, head bowed, as if in permanent petition. Lancaster County in the 1820s is a place of both order and unease. The War of 1812 is not so far behind that men have forgotten how a distant conflict can reach into a house like a cold draft. The Panic of 1819 pulled coins out of pockets and left debts standing like gravestones in ledgers. The Second Great Awakening has sent waves of revival through towns that once prided themselves on sober meeting houses and modest sermons. In the barns and by the hearths, people argue about the correct measures for a life, how much to trust reason, how much to surrender to feeling, how much to fear a God who sees everything. It is in this atmosphere that the sleeping sisters become a battleground where belief and measurement push against each other. The physician's book says one thing, the preachers say another. Neighbors bring their own explanations of vow broken, a curse spoken, a secret shame in the family that has called down a visible sentence. A few whisper of mesmerists and traveling showmen who put girls into trances for money and wonder if the Herricks, decent as they seem, are staging a longer show. It is an ugly thought. It does not square with the slow strength required to sit with two unmoving daughters and feed them one spoon at a time for a year, then another year after that. And then, after more than 2 years in which the sisters have breathed and slept and done nothing else, they begin to wake. It happens quietly, which is to say it happens without trumpets. The mother notices first. Mary's fingers move. Eliza's eyes flicker. Dr. Tate records that Mary took a deeper breath than usual, that Eliza's lips formed the beginning of a word. He writes that he said their names, and they turned their faces toward him, like flowers that feel the sun through a window. He writes that they opened their eyes. The town holds its breath. The ministers prepare 2 sermons, one for a miracle and one for a rebuke. Neighbors come to the lane in greater numbers than before, and stand with their hands folded, as if they are in church under the blue of the sky. What Mary and Eliza say, when they can finally say anything at all, becomes the most troubling part of the entire affair. They describe, in plain detail, things that occurred while they slept. That winter's ice storm that broke the old ash tree on the green. The night the mill caught and was saved by buckets passed hand to hand. The burial of a child 3 farms over, and the way the bell rope in the meeting house slipped and burned a man's palm. They speak of their mother's hands being chapped to the point of bleeding, and of their father sitting at the foot of the bed, when he thought no one was watching him, and letting his head sink into his own hands. They recount the dates with a steadiness that unsettles even the calmest listener. How could they know? Someone asks, and another agrees that it is a proper question. Dr. Tate puts down his pen and chooses his words slowly. He describes the possibility of awareness without waking, of senses that collect without conscious consent. He uses the only language he has, which is clinical and cautious. Others use different language. They say, vision. They say, divine punishment lifted. A few say, devil's work. But they say it under their breath and not in front of the mother, who has stood a long watch and is in no mood for men who make answers sound easy. There should be a record that preserves what happened next. There should be a folder in a city cabinet with the Herrick name on it. For Dr. Tate was thorough, and when the Pennsylvania Medical College asked physicians across the state to share unusual cases, he complied. He copied his notes carefully, added a covering letter, and sent the file to Philadelphia. For decades, that file existed. It was consulted by students who wanted to be clever at dinners and professors who wanted to be sober in lectures. And then, in 1894, when a fire consumed the college's library, the Herrick file vanished. It did not appear in the list of materials saved. It did not appear in the list of materials destroyed. It simply ceased to be where it should have been. Was the file taken before the fire by someone who preferred mysteries to be tidy? Was it burned among the oak shelves by accident? Was it borrowed and never returned by a man more interested in stories than in stewardship? The absence is its own kind of presence. It makes a shape in the air where facts should sit. So we are left with what remains, a doctor's day book that survived in a family trunk long enough to be read and copied by a later hand, a handful of notices in local papers that preferred terms like singular case, a set of church minutes that record an unusual number of special meetings in the years 1821 to 1823, and the recall of people who lived long enough to be interviewed by grandchildren who wrote things down. The girls themselves lived on to an age their mother must have prayed for. They married or they did not. They had children or they did not. Those ordinary facts, which would have fixed them in place, are blurred by the heat of the story that came before them. What did Lancaster County witness that autumn morning in 1821, when two girls lay still and kept breathing? Was it an illness that had no name because the people of the time had not yet made one? Was it a trial sent from heaven to bend a family's back? Was it a trick of perception, a long, strange trance in which the eyes stayed closed while the mind stayed open? Or was it something else entirely, something that resists both prayer and measurement? We are going to step carefully into their rooms and look at what can be seen. We will pull the surviving lines from the edge of the fire and hold them up to the light. We will listen for the plainest words spoken about an event that people preferred to interpret. But why did this happen? And why did the record that could have settled it vanish into smoke and ash? Before we continue, if this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And tell us what city or state you are listening from. We love hearing from our community of history enthusiasts. To understand Mary and Eliza Herrick, we must first understand the lane they lived on and the mind of Lancaster County in 1821. The county's fields were orderly, the hedgerows were neat, and the people were a mixture of English, descended families who worshipped in plain meeting houses and Pennsylvania Germans who kept to careful ways and spoke a softened dialect at market. The rhythm of life was strict, but it was not joyless. Children learned their letters from hornbooks. Mothers kept family Bibles with the births and deaths written on fly leaves. And fathers measured prosperity in stacked cordwood and full granaries rather than in coins. The Herrick farm sat at the edge of that settled world. The house was a simple two-story with a stone foundation, whitewashed in summer, with shutters painted the dark green that never fades from memory. The barn faced the prevailing wind. The spring house kept milk cool behind a wooden door that breathed softly with the run of water under it. Inside the house, a crane swung in the fireplace for the heavy kettles, and a chest by the window held the sisters' Sunday dresses folded in blue paper to keep moths away. The family Bible, whose existence is recorded in the notes of a cousin who later settled near Reading, listed the births in a neat hand. Mary, born 1804. Eliza, born 1806. During good winters, the mother would polish those pages with the side of her palm to keep the ink clear. The father, whose name appears as Thomas in a tax roll from 1819 and as T. Herrick in a store ledger that survives at the County Historical Society, kept account of seed nails and the occasional ribbon with numbers that balanced to the penny. The girls were known to their neighbors in the ordinary ways that rural girls are known. Mary was quiet and fond of reading the same psalm several times in a row. Eliza was quicker in her movements and quicker to laugh. They helped with the dairy, the spinning, and the mending. In summer they carried water to the men in the hayfield. In winter they beat rugs in the snow and warmed their hands over the stove until the skin tightened. Nothing in their early lives suggested that they would become the subject of sermons and medical notes. Lancaster County in those years stood between two moods that did not sit easily together. It held to a sober, German-influenced piety that preferred long sermons and predictable Sundays. At the same time, the waves of the Second Great Awakening were pushing into Pennsylvania from the west and the south, bringing camp meetings, weeping conversions, the talk of signs and wonders. The plain families looked on such displays with discomfort. The Methodists and Baptists who rode the circuits looked on the plain families and asked whether their restraint had turned to coldness. In barns and kitchens, people argued about the right way to feel God and the right way to measure truth. Medicine mirrored that tension. Philadelphia, a day's travel by good horse, boasted schools where celebrated men lectured on anatomy with confidence and on the balance of humors with a certainty that now seems misplaced. In the countryside, most physicians learned by apprenticeship. They kept daybooks in which they wrote charges for bleeding, blistering, purging, and the application of poultices. They carried vials of calomel and laudanum and a tin of leeches. A few were careless. A few were greedy. Many were steady and believed that observation would keep them honest. Elijah Tate belonged to this last group. He had trained under an older practitioner, spent a winter session in the city to hear lectures, and returned with a stack of stitched pamphlets and a habit of writing exactly what he saw. There are small archival traces of his life. A handbill advertising inoculation against smallpox in 1818 carries his name among 3 others. A bound notebook in a private collection includes his entries on fevers that ran along the river in late summer. He called them, using the old word, and noting carefully who lived by low water and who did not. In that same notebook, his entries for the Herrick sisters begin in the autumn of 1821 with the plain, measured words of a man who would rather be exact than dramatic. Before the sleep took hold, there were minor events that later witnesses tried to turn into omens. A cousin remembered that Mary had fainted in July while lifting a kettle that was too heavy for her. The mother admitted to a neighbor that Eliza had suffered spells during the harvest heat and needed cool cloths on her forehead. A line in a church minute book, one that does not mention the girls by name, notes a fever sweeping some households in late August, followed by a request that parishioners pray for mercy in our trials. None of these details prove a cause. They establish the texture of the months that led to the morning when the mother set down a cup by the bed, and the girl did not wake. The first weeks of the sleeping state were full of practical adjustments that the wider world does not see. The mother learned the angle at which a spoon could deliver broth to closed lips without choking the daughter. The father rigged a swinging cradle for the water kettle so that the house could be warmed without constant tending of the hearth. A younger brother slept on a pallet near the door and was told to tell the truth if anyone asked him questions. A neighbor girl came 3 mornings a week to help with the washing, and for that kindness the Herricks paid in butter and yarn. Visitors were inevitable. Some came with kindness. Some came with curiosity. A note in the back pages of a Lancaster paper. Its ink faded, but the words still legible in the microfilm used the phrase, "a singular case in our county," and urged readers to avoid idle talk and ungenerous conjecture. The admonition did little to slow the traffic up the lane. Men in good coats quoted scripture about signs and lying wonders. Women stood at the bed, looked at the sisters' hands, and wondered how fingers that did not move could remain so pink and warm. Religious leaders entered the story because Lancaster County asked them to. One pastor, careful and pastoral, called for patience and charity. Another, sharpened by the drama of the revivals, declared from his pulpit that God had made an example of the family and the town. He did not say why God had chosen this family. He let the implication do the work that his words did not do. The meeting house minutes show a flurry of unscheduled gatherings in late 1821 and early 1822. They record collective prayers but do not record names. That omission protected the sisters and also turned them into a public symbol that anyone with an argument to make could seize. In the shadow of these sermons, Dr. Tate kept his routine. He came daily at first, then several times a week when the pattern of the sisters' sleep proved steady. He tested reflexes gently. He held a candle near each eye and watched the pupils narrow. He applied mild irritants to the skin to rule out paralysis. He pricked a finger and observed the flow of blood and the absence of reaction. He recorded respiration rates and pulse rates and the consistency of skin temperature, season by season. He noted the absence of bebsores, which was evidence that the mother was turning the girls regularly. His language remained technical. He avoided diagnosis because none fit. There were other frameworks pressing in. Through pamphlets and travelers' tales, the county had heard whispers of animal magnetism, the European craze in which men with fixed eyes and heavy hands induced magnetic sleep and claimed to unlock hidden senses. In 1821, those practices were not common in rural Pennsylvania, but the words were beginning to arrive, detached from their original contexts and stripped down to rumor. A man who had seen a demonstration in Boston told a tavern audience that minds could be linked at a distance, that sleepers could see without opening their eyes. He said such things with a storyteller's relish, and he did not have to stay to see the trouble his talk caused in a house where two girls kept breathing without waking. The Herricks were not a family inclined to theatrics. The father refused a traveling showman who offered money if he could exhibit the girls under a tent for an afternoon. The mother stopped receiving certain callers when their questions turned coarse. The neighbors noticed the narrowing circle and drew their own conclusions. Some admired the family's privacy. Others suspected pride. A few, perhaps unsettled by a mystery that did not obey their favorite explanation, whispered that the whole affair was contrived. Those whispers did not last long among people who had seen the mother's red eyes and the father's stooped shoulders. Dr. Tate's notes, which later formed the basis of the file he sent to Philadelphia, did more than tally pulses. They described the household labor that kept the girls alive, which an urban physician might have missed. He recorded that broth was taken in, that waste was passed, that skin remained intact, that hair was combed and trimmed to prevent tangles and sores. He wrote that the sisters' faces retained their color and that their breathing was even. He refrained from conclusions. He believed in building a record that could outlast talk. That record traveled. When the Pennsylvania Medical College, an institution whose library later burned, solicited unusual case reports from across the state, Tate copied his notes, added a letter that summarized the course of the sisters' condition from the autumn of 1821 through the subsequent seasons, and dispatched the packet to the city. It entered an archive that held gallstones in jars, bones with healed fractures, and neat files of maladies with names that promised meaning. The Herrick file bore a label in a clerk's hand, Somnolence, Extraordinary, Lancaster County. Its pages were turned by students who were taught to be skeptical, and by lecturers who were paid to be precise. Meanwhile, life in the county moved on, and the Herricks adjusted to a new normal that would have broken many families. The seasons continued to leave their marks on the farm. Mud at the threshold in spring, flies at the window in summer, the slant of early darkness in winter. The girls slept. Their bodies did not fail. Their mother aged in the way of a person who does not sleep deeply for years. Their father's hair went gray at the temples, and his handwriting grew tighter, as if each line cost him more. There were moments when belief and measurement collided in ways that would have been recognizable anywhere in early 19th century America. A circuit riding preacher insisted on praying over the girls and called them to wake as Jesus had called Lazarus. When nothing happened, he left the house with a complaint about hardened hearts. A Philadelphia gentleman arrived with a small magnet and a sheaf of notes and asked for permission to conduct an experiment. Dr. Tate refused him because he saw no virtue in turning a sick room into a lecture hall. A farmer's wife laid a hand on Mary's wrist and said, later, that she had felt a flutter that convinced her the girl was listening in some way. People told their versions of the same minutes, and their versions reflected more about them than about the girls. What seems ordinary now was not ordinary then. The idea that a person could be unconscious for months and yet live, the idea that sensation and awareness might decouple from waking, the idea that the mind could register events without the body moving. In the 1820s, there were European reports of magnetic somnambulism, and of young women in Swabia or Paris who spoke of distant happenings while in trances, but those pamphlets arrived late and were greeted with equal parts fascination and scorn. In Lancaster County, where the rhythm of life was measured in chores done and prayers said. Such reports landed like sparks on damp ground. By the time the sisters began, very gently, to stir, first a twitch of fingers, then an eyelid that fluttered, and then a face that turned toward a voice. Their story was no longer entirely theirs. It belonged to the doctor's tidy handwriting, to ministers' sermons, to neighbors' accounts, and to a growing file in a city cabinet. The moment they opened their eyes, 2 years' worth of louder voices pressed in to insist that the meaning of their sleep fit one framework or another. The backstory is, therefore, not a list of causes. It is a map of a community's expectations and a record of one physician's insistence on writing down what he could defend. The final thread in that backstory is the file itself. For decades, students and professors in Philadelphia could call it up, read how Tate described sustained pulse and stable respiration, and debate the likely mechanisms. In 1894, a fire destroyed the medical college's library. Official notices recorded the loss of shelves, instruments, and portion of the case histories, a phrase that can mean almost anything. After the fire, the Herrick file was gone. It did not appear in the list of saved materials. It did not appear among the charred remains catalogued for insurance. Its absence coincided with the flames in a way that made sense on paper and left room for doubt in the minds of people who preferred harder edges to their facts. What remains, then, as we move from background to the events themselves, are partial records and the stubborn impressions of people who stood near the beds and refused to lie, even when others asked them to make the story simpler. The Herrick Lane, the meeting house sermons, the physician's habit of writing what he could measure, and the city's appetite for unusual miracles that might be explained. These are the forces that shaped what followed when two sisters who had slept for more than 2 years opened their eyes and began to speak. The first day the sleep held was a Tuesday. The second day was a Wednesday. By Friday, the Herrick Lane had already learned to be quiet near the farmhouse, as if a loud voice could turn a strange sleep into a death. Dr. Eliza Tate started a routine that would become its own kind of clock. At sunrise he stepped through the door, left his cane by the jamb, and set his leather bag on the table. He moved between the 2 rooms, observing without haste and recording without adornment. He felt for the radial pulse at the wrist, counted to 60 in his head while the watch in his palm ticked, and noted 64 beside Mary and 65 beside Eliza. He watched the fine lace of breath at each nose and counted again. He drew the curtain back a hand's breadth and held a candle near each face. "Pupils obedient to light," he wrote. He touched the skin with the back of his hand. Warm. He pricked the pad of a finger with a needle and noted the droplet of blood and the absence of any flinch. He recorded, "sleeping state," because that was the only phrase that did not claim more than he could defend. In the first week he tried the simple provocations physicians of his day trusted. A feather at the eyelashes, a pinch above the elbow, a drop of hartshorn beneath the nose. He stopped short of blistering or bleeding, because he had no diagnosis to justify either, and because the mother's face went hard when anyone spoke of harsher measures. "You will not make holes in my daughters for the sake of your book," she said, and he made a small bow that said he had heard and understood. By the end of the first month, the house had adapted. The mother kept broth on the crane and learned to touch a spoon to the corner of each girl's mouth, at such an angle that the liquid flowed in and did not flood the throat. The father planed a length of ash and set it across 2 chairs to make a table that could be moved over a bed for washing and combing. A neighbor girl with neat plates came mornings to help turn the sisters and rub their backs with lard and camphor to keep the skin whole. The linen was changed with quiet efficiency and hung to dry where the barn shadow fell. If there was a secret in the house, it was not that the girls slept. It was the stubborn, ordinary work that kept sleep from becoming decay. Rumor, of course, did not keep to the hedgerow. It ran down to the mill. It climbed into wagons. It reached the meeting house, where on a cold evening with lanterns smoking, the elders gathered without announcing it in advance. The minutes from that night survive in a neat hand that keeps emotion out of the ink. Met for prayer in regard to an affliction in our neighborhood. Resolved to entreat the Lord for mercy and to avoid idle talk. 2 nights later, an itinerant minister from the circuit stopped on his way through, stood in the Herrick kitchen with steam rising from his coat, and announced without being asked that God had set a sign that would either soften hearts or harden them. He asked to lay hands on the girls. The mother consented to prayer but not to hands. He prayed anyway. Nothing changed. Dr. Tate kept his own counsel in the face of sermons. He invited one older physician from the next town to observe, and then a second, because he wanted witnesses who understood the value of agreeing on what had been seen. They confirmed his notes. Pulse steady. The first said, surprised by the evenness. The second examined the eyes and spoke in a low voice, so that the sisters would not hear even if they somehow heard. "They are not pretending," he said. It was not a diagnosis. It was, in its way, an act of respect. In December, the first real test of the house's defenses came in the form of a man from the city who carried a folio and a zealous belief that modern ideas could explain everything, if only rural minds would allow it. He asked to demonstrate the effect of a magnet held at the heart. He used words like somnambulism and mesmeric report, words that made the father bristle and the mother fold her hands tighter, because to her mind the only rapport in the room was the kind she had with her daughters, built on years of chores and laughter and scolding and bread. Dr. Tate stepped between the stranger and the bed. "You may observe," he said, "but you may not experiment." The man left with offended dignity and gave a speech at a tavern in town that evening about rustic ignorance. Men clapped in the room. The next morning, the Herrick lane was twice as busy with visitors as it had been the week before, when winter cut the fields to stubble and put fox prints on the lane. It brought a quietness to the farmhouse that suited the sleeping state too well. The sisters lay under quilts their grandmother had pieced, with patterns the mother could name by touch in the dark. The stove hissed. The world narrowed. In January, a neighbor boy scratched his initials into the frost on the window and peered in, hoping for the thrill of a tableau he could describe to the boys at the mill pond. He saw 2 girls with their hair combed smooth and their hands folded so gently that for an instant he thought he was looking at a wake. The sight made him ashamed of himself, though he would not admit that part when he told the story later. It was during that winter that Dr. Tate began to suspect that the sisters heard without waking. He had been reading in a borrowed pamphlet about the hearing that abides, a poet's phrase he would never have used himself, and he set it aside with a small snort. Yet one afternoon he leaned close to Mary's ear and said in a matter-of-fact tone, "Tomorrow I will bring you a story from the book of Ruth." The next day, when he opened the Bible at the foot of the bed and began, he saw the faintest change in the line of Mary's mouth, a softening, almost a smile. He did not write that down. He did, however, begin to announce himself to each girl when he entered and saw, more often than not, a minute shift in their breathing, as if they had set some inner attention toward his voice. In March, ice lifted on the creek and went clattering downstream like broken crockery. The first thunder of the year came on a Sunday, as if to compete with the sermons. The minister in the meeting house spoke of storms and of Jonah. The minister from the circuit spoke of signs. He had learned that the girls had not responded to his first visit, and he took that as a challenge. He returned with loud prayers and a certainty sharpened by the resistance he had met. He stood at Mary's bedside and called her by name, as if the force of his voice could do what time and tenderness had not. When nothing happened, he declared that the devil was present in the house. The father turned him out and told him not to darken the threshold again. The argument carried out into the yard and down the lane, where it became a story about a man thrown bodily from a farmhouse. In truth, the shove was slight. It was the humiliation that did the bruising. Spring brought new tests for the household that had learned to be a hospital. Flies found their way into any room where moisture lingered. The mother fought them with cloths and patience. The younger brother learned to sit with a branch of leaves and keep the air moving over the beds. The neighbors, who had been generous with soup and bread in the first months, began to worry. Charity is a strong horse in the country, but it tires if ridden too hard. A few women sent fresh linen because they understood what it cost to launder and to iron and to keep a sick room sweet. Others decided the family was proud, and pride deserves to sweat alone. By summer, the unusual had become routine in a way that was more disturbing than the first shock. The Herricks had lived a year with daughters who breathed and did not wake. People stopped coming as often. The minister found new texts. The boys at the mill pond talked about other things. The mother's hands cracked with work and healed and cracked again. Dr. Tate's entries sharpened. No change. No decubitus. Appetite maintained when spoon-fed. Voiding regular. He took to tying a thread around each girl's index finger and knotting the ends over the bedpost in such a way that the smallest movement would disturb the thread. Some afternoons, when the house was quiet, he would find the threads shifted when he returned, not by much, but enough to think that some muscle had acted while he was away. On an August night, lightning struck the ash tree on the green and shattered one great limb. The mill caught fire at the cupola and was saved by buckets passed hand to hand until dawn. A child 3 farms over died of summer fever, and the meeting house bell rope slipped in a man's hand and burned him to the bone. These were the events that would later form the core of the sisters' account, but at the time they were simply what summer does in a county where weather and accident are as common as gossip. In the second winter, with the house sealed against the cold, a crisis came from an unexpected direction. A man from the county committee called, gentle in his speech but implacable in his intent. There had been talk, he said, of moving the girls to the almshouse where there were arrangements for long illnesses. The father said no for the first time without his voice shaking. The mother said no with a steadiness that surprised even her. Dr. Tate spoke for them to the committee in a letter that survives in a drawer at the Historical Society, the ink browned, the hand calmer than he may have felt. Removal would do harm and no good. The present care is sufficient and kind. The community's curiosity is not a medical indication. After that, the county looked away again. But in that looking away, there was a choice that would echo years later, when men tried to decide whether the Herricks had been allowed too much privacy. The line between a family's right to guard its sick and a community's duty to protect its vulnerable is not bright. It is a soft edge, easily stepped over by men with good intentions and by men who prefer not to have to look at hard things. As the second year waned, small changes appeared at the edge of the stillness. One afternoon in late February, the neighbor girl who helped with the washing exclaimed so suddenly that the mother dropped a cup. A single tear had gathered in the corner of Eliza's eye and made a track into her hair. It was not from a cry. It was not from a cough. It was simply there, as if her body had decided to remind everyone present that it could still produce such things. The mother wiped it away with her thumb. The news spread down the lane with such speed that, by evening 3 different versions were being told at the mill about how the girl had cried out her repentance. In truth, she had wept 1 tear and then resumed her even breathing. The way people told it said more about their needs than about Eliza's state. In early March, on a day when the wind made the house click, Mary's fingers moved. It was not a lifting, not a gesture, only a slow curling and uncurling that would have looked like nothing to anyone who had not been staring at those hands for 18 months. The mother called for the doctor, whose gig wheels cut ruts in the thawing lane. He saw the motion, swallowed the impulse to give it a name too quickly, and wrote, "Movement observed." He did not change the rest of his routine. The next day there was no movement, and he wrote that down too. What changed next was not visible. It was audible. On a rain-soft morning toward the end of that month, the mother heard a sound from Mary's bed that was not breathing. It was the beginning of a word, not the word itself, only the shape of it. She put her ear close and heard it again, air meeting tongue, a syllable without a shape. She called to Eliza by the doorway and saw the same faint articulation. She began to say their names out loud between tasks. Mary, she would say, as she wrung linen. Eliza, as she trimmed a nail. If the responses were anything at all, they were too slight for anyone but a mother to claim. That did not make them untrue. Then, with the patience of a clock that had kept to its pace for more than 2 years, the sleep lightened. Fingers twitched. Eyelids fluttered. Mouths moved without sound and then with sound. The doctor began to speak more in their presence about the ordinary details of the day. I met Daniel at the ford, he would say, and paused to see if any echo came. The sisters' breaths sometimes shifted at such stories, as if their bodies were orienting toward the familiar shape of a name. The first opening of eyes happened on an afternoon, when the house smelled of lye soap and fresh bread, and the sky had the particular chalkiness that comes before a late snow. Mary's lashes lifted. Her eyes did not focus at once. They drifted, then steadied on the gleam of the kettle at the hearth, and then, slowly, on her mother's face. The expression that followed was not the wonder strangers might expect in such a story. It was recognition as unadorned as a nod. A breath. Then the line of her mouth softened. The mother did not make a sound because she knew any sharpness, even joy, could close that small fragile door. Eliza's eyes opened the next day. Dr. Tate wrote the same words for both. Eyes opened, sought familiar faces, respiration unchanged, pulse steady. He added a line that he would probably have left out if he had been writing for a city journal. Mother smiled with her mouth closed. The town's restraint lasted only hours. The lane filled, then the road, then the space near the meeting house. Men who fancied themselves practical said it was time for tests. Ministers who lived for moments like this began to form their sermons in the air with their hands. The mother insisted on one rule: no more crowds in the house. The doctor backed her. The father stood at the gate and shook his head until men, who had seldom been denied anything in their lives, found themselves walking away from a farmer because they had no argument with which to force themselves past him. In the small circle permitted to be near the beds, the strangest part of the story began to form in the room. Mary and Eliza, weak as new calves and pale from the unlit seasons, began to speak of things that had happened while they slept. They spoke in simple sentences, without drama, like people remembering chores they had done. The ash tree broke, Mary said. They brought the buckets. Eliza said. The bell rope burned him, Mary said later. And when the mother frowned at that detail, for how could any sleeping girl know such a particular? Eliza named the man who had been burned, and the mother's eyes filled because the girls were describing not town talk, but the precise shape of events in a way that sounded like memory. Dr. Tate did not recoil into denial or leap toward miracle. He did what he knew how to do. He asked questions that could be verified. What day did the branch fall? He asked, careful to avoid leading words. On a Wednesday, Mary said. He checked the day in his pocket almanac and in his mind. The branch had fallen on a Wednesday night. He asked about the mill fire. Eliza said, the men passed buckets until dawn. That was not a detail that a sleeping girl could not have guessed, but she added that Mr. B. lost the skin of his palms, and that he went to his wife's sister for a linen that had belonged to their mother, because it did not sting as much as the coarser cloth. Dr. Tate did not know that piece, but the mother did, because she had sent a corner of that linen herself. When he walked to the mill yard that evening under the thinning clouds, he found the man with his palms bandaged and the wife's sister nodding when asked, embarrassed by the attention but unable to deny that the girls had named a thing that had not been written down. The doctor tried other questions, some from beyond the hedgerow. What did the minister preach the Sunday after the storm? He asked. Mary said, Jonah, which was not remarkable, because Jonah is always close to hand in seasons of trouble. He asked about the child's burial 3 farms over. Eliza said the verse read at the grave was, Suffer the little children to come unto me, which was again a common choice. She added that the grandmother had not been able to say the words of the hymn and had clutched the book to her chest without opening it. That detail could have been guessed by any person who has watched a funeral. It could also have been learned by a body that had lain still while the heart listened. Skeptics applied pressure in the ways they knew. A man from the city returned with a notebook and a look of quiet triumph he had been saving for a year. He suggested that the sisters had heard everything and simply turned those sounds into a story. That was plausible. The mother said as much when the house was quiet. She had long suspected that her daughters' bodies were not dead to sound. Another man suggested that the family had whispered the events into the sisters' ears as part of an elaborate scheme to create a miracle that would make them famous. The suggestion died in the room when he watched the mother adjust a pillow with the care of a woman who had not slept properly in 2 years and had no appetite for fame. The most honest test came from the doctor. He asked about events that had not echoed loudly enough to reach even the Herrick lane. What happened in Mr. S.'s barn last October? He asked, choosing a place far to the south of the farm, where a roof had fallen after a threshing. The girls looked puzzled. They shook their heads. That was paradoxically reassuring. It suggested that they had not acquired a magic sight. It suggested something less spectacular and more strange, that the mind can register a life's immediate circumference while the body refuses to rise and do the things a life demands. As the sisters' speech returned, movement followed. They turned their heads. They lifted their hands a little from the coverlet. The muscles in their forearms showed the wobble of lack of use and wanted time. The mother learned a new routine to replace the old one. She fed them thicker broth. She coaxed them to sit. She eased their feet to the floor and held them there while they trembled at the shock of bearing weight. The boys who had peered through the window a year earlier pretended to lose interest, and then watched through the hedgerow as girls relearned how to take a first step at an age when their peers were already women with households of their own. Meanwhile, the meanings multiplied the way meanings always do when an extraordinary event meets a community that needs stories to make sense of itself. One minister preached that God had lifted a chastening after the town repented of gossip and hard-heartedness. Another preached that God had lifted a chastening because the father had turned out a proud man of the cloth who mistook volume for faith. Men who leaned toward science without much training used the Herrick kitchen as a chalkboard upon which they drew their theories: a disorder of the nerves, a condition of the womb, a trance brought on by summer fevers that would be named properly in some century that was not yet here. Women spoke more softly among themselves about endurance and about the strange ways the body can do its work when other parts are not doing theirs. They heard us, one neighbor said. They heard the house. The county paper, which had been restrained to its credit, finally printed more than a notice. The singular case in our county continues to engage curiosity. It wrote in careful prose, 2 young women, after a prolonged period of insensibility, have awoken and have related particulars of neighborhood events which, if not extraordinary, are at least notable for their accuracy. The article refused to say what accuracy meant because to say so would have invited letters and arguments that could not be settled in print. A week later, a letter did arrive accusing the paper of credulity and the family of play-acting. The editor chose not to run it. He may have believed the letter. He chose peace over a fight in his pages. Lancaster County has always had a talent for containing a quarrel by never beginning it publicly. Dr. Tate, who had resisted grand words for 2 years, wrote a summary letter to a colleague in the city. He described the onset in the autumn of 1821, the sustained pulse and stable respiration, the lack of wasting, the absence of bed sores, the regularity with which nourishment was accepted, and the patient, routine care that a mother and a household provided. He added a careful paragraph about the awakening and the sisters' accounts of neighborhood events. He used phrases like probable awareness without wakefulness and retentive faculty engaged during apparent somnolence. He did not write miracle. He did not write magnetism. He wrote the words he could sign. That packet became the file that would later vanish in fire. the absence of which would inflame imaginations a generation later. At the time, it simply moved down the post road in a saddlebag. In the medical college's library, a clerk labeled it with a tidy hand. A professor used it as a prop in a lecture about states of consciousness. The profession did not yet have words to chart. A student copied the pulse counts into his own notebook, without the labor of having to count them himself. The sister's breaths and the mother's hours were turned into numbers that taught a room full of young men how to speak calmly about bodies they would never see. In the Herrick house, the return to ordinary life was slow enough to be nearly invisible from one day to the next, and dramatic when measured against the 2 years that had come before. By midsummer, Mary could stand long enough to look out the window at the lane and comment on the shape of the clouds like any woman stirring a pot. Eliza could hold a book. Their voices gained weight. Their cheeks showed color that was not merely the glow of a warm room. Their mother slept a whole night without waking, and when she woke without the shock of having fallen deeply asleep, she wept and laughed in the same breath, a private earthquake. The town's attention drifted. The ministers found other texts. The mill burned for ordinary reasons and was repaired for ordinary reasons. Boys wrote new initials in dust. People told the story for a time, and then they told it only when a stranger asked at a table, after a funeral, and then, over years, they did not tell it at all. It lodged, instead, in the quiet places where family stories live, to be taken down when a grandchild asked why the mother always sat facing the door, or why the father still lowered his voice when he passed the room where the beds had been. The strangeness, once the wakefulness returned, was not only in what the sisters had said about the months when their eyes were closed. It was in the memory of the way the town had behaved while they slept. The father remembered who had carried buckets and who had carried rumors. The mother remembered the shape of the minister's jaw and the shape of his pride. Dr. Tate remembered the thread he had tied to a finger and the small shift it had made when no one was watching. And the sisters remembered the sound of rain on the roof in February, and of a spoon against a cup in April, and of the bell rope slipping through calloused hands in June. When asked, years later, what they remembered of those 2 years, they did not describe visions. They described a house. This is the shape of the story as it grows from the first eyelash quiver to the first step. It is not clean. It is not easy. It does not grant any side the triumph of being right in the way that feels most satisfying. It gives the ministers their text and the doctor his numbers. It gives the neighbors their sighs and their suspicions. It gives the sisters back to themselves slowly, with labor, and it leaves, in its wake, a file in a city library that will one day be listed on a shelf, and then, after flames, be listed nowhere at all. The last entry in Dr. Tate's daybook regarding the sisters is brief. It reads, "Patients Mary H. and Eliza H. can sit, converse sensibly, and take nourishment by their own hand. Tone of voice normal. Memory for the past 2 years remarkable in local particulars. Prognosis good." Beneath it is a line he did not need to write, but could not help adding. Mother appears much relieved. It is a physician's dry kindness to notice the person who did the most work and received the least credit. The town would move on. The file would travel. The family would settle back into a pattern that no longer required counting breaths at night. But the questions that hung in the room when the girls first opened their eyes did not dissolve with summer heat. They hardened into the kind of questions that a county hands down as quietly as it hands down quilts. How does a mind listen when a body refuses the world? What do we owe those who insist on counting and writing when others would prefer to shout? At what point does a miracle become a measure? And at what point does a measure become a miracle because it permits a family to survive? Those are the questions that will haunt the investigation that follows, when the file that might have made neat work of them disappears into smoke and someone, years later, opens a box in a historical society and finds, in an old daybook, the steady marks of a doctor who refused to guess. An investigation, in this case, did not wear a badge. It wore a black ribbon in the hair, a leather bag, and a habit of counting. Dr. Elijah Tate was the first and only person to keep a steady record. He did not preach. He did not perform. He returned, measured, and wrote. He invited 2 senior physicians from the next towns to witness the sisters in their sleeping state. They confirmed his observations and left their names in his daybook margins with neat initials. Beyond that, there was no formal inquiry. There was no coroner because there was no death. There was no court because there was no crime. The clergy investigated in their way. They held meetings, framed the sleep as a moral episode, and issued explanations suited to the pulpits from which they spoke. The county committee briefly considered removing the girls to the almshouse, but a letter from Dr. Tate, calm and direct, persuaded them to leave the family in peace, and decades later, after the sisters had returned to ordinary life, a young local historian gathered reminiscences for a talk at the Lyceum. He quoted parish minutes, a line from the newspaper, and a farmer's memory of a winter that seemed to last forever. He did not attempt to settle the matter. He merely tried to record it before it slipped into rumor. Then there is the city. The Pennsylvania Medical College requested unusual case histories, and Tate obliged. The file he compiled was read and taught from for years. In 1894, the college's library burned. The Herrick file disappeared. The timing invites conjecture. Some say the file perished with the shelves. Others say it walked out of the building in a pocket or a satchel before the flames. In either case, the loss turned a medical puzzle into a historical mystery. Without that file, we have a daybook in a county drawer, a handful of printed notices, and the oral tradition of a lane that knew how to hold its tongue. What follows are the leading explanations that grew around the facts, each with its own evidence and weaknesses. Theory 1. Prolonged catatonia or dissociative stupor. This is the most sober medical reading. Catatonia is a syndrome in which the body becomes still, the speech disappears, and responsiveness to the environment dwindles. It can be linked to mood disorders, psychosis, or medical illness. A dissociative stupor is a related condition in which overwhelming stress or trauma leads to a shutdown that looks like sleep, but is not sleep. These conditions can last weeks or months. They can, in rare cases, persist much longer. They can preserve autonomic functions, breathing, heart rate, basic regulation. They can leave reflexes muted. They can end abruptly, with return to speech and movement. What fits the Herrick sisters' stable pulse and respiration? The absence of wasting when properly fed, the lack of bedsores because of careful turning, and the sudden, gentle return of movement and speech. Their memory for household details and neighborhood events also fits modern observations that some people in reduced states still process sounds. Today, EEG studies show that even profoundly unresponsive patients may register their own names and familiar voices. Families report that those who slept later recall conversations at the bedside. What does not fit? 2 sisters entering the same state at the same time and staying in it for more than 2 years strains probability. Shared stress is possible in a tight, knit household, especially under heavy religious pressure and a season of fevers, but the simultaneity is unusual. Also, 19th century physicians did not use the word catatonia. The term would not be coined until later. That does not mean the syndrome did not exist. It means the contemporaries lacked the label. Theory 2. Post-infectious encephalopathy. Illness preceded the sleep. Church minutes mention fever. A cousin recalled spells. An infection could have affected the brain, leaving the sisters in a prolonged state of reduced consciousness. Viral encephalitis can induce stupor. Recovery can be slow. People can regain function with memory for events close at hand, because of hearing preserved during convalescence. What fits the timing? The steady vital signs once the acute illness passed, the slow return of function, the lack of reported pain, the fact that both sisters could have contracted the same febrile illness at home. What does not fit? Encephalitis, severe enough to silence 2 people for years, often leaves marks. Weakness, seizures, changes in personality. Dr. Tate noted weakness from disuse, but not neurological deficits. The sisters' speech and memory were described as clear. 2 cases in one household may be plausible in a contagion, but the duration remains extraordinary. Theory 3. Mesmeric or Magnetic. Sleep with heightened hearing. The 1820s were the threshold of the American fascination with mesmerism. Practitioners claimed to induce magnetic sleep, a trance in which subjects remained still, could not be roused by ordinary means, and displayed unusual sensitivity to sound and suggestion. Advocates later reported lucid somnambulists who could recount events they had not witnessed in the normal sense. Sober physicians distrusted these claims, but the language drifted into parlors and pulpits. What fits? The sisters' quiescence combined with their later recall of neighborhood events, including private details that did not carry broadly. Their ability to hear the house would be explained, under this theory, as an effect of entrancement that sharpened hearing and memory, while shutting down movement. What does not fit? There was no mesmerist in the Herrick kitchen. Dr. Tate barred attempts to experiment. The family did not seek demonstrations. Without an operator and repeated inductions, mesmeric theory collapses into a label pasted over observations better explained by ordinary hearing during a prolonged stupor. Theory 4. A shared conversion disorder. Conversion disorder, now called functional neurological disorder, is a condition in which psychological distress expresses itself as paralysis, mutism, or other neurological symptoms without detectable structural disease. Shared conditions can occur in tight social units, especially under moral stress or fear. In an early 19th century community caught between sober piety and revivalist fervor, with sermons thundering about signs and punishments, two sisters might, under crushing expectations, turn inward together. What fits? The cultural pressure, the shared onset, the lack of medical signs beyond reduced responsiveness, the way the condition resolved without specific treatment beyond time, safety and routine. What does not fit? 2 years is a long time. Simultaneity again stresses plausibility. Also, functional conditions often show variability with attention. Dr. Tate's entries suggest a steady state with minor fluctuations, not theatrically timed symptoms. The family refused attention and money. That refusal weakens the case for performance or secondary gain. Theory 5. A fraud sustained for reputation or relief. A darker reading is simple. The family staged or prolonged a fiction. The motive could have been fame, pity, or charity in kind. The routine could have been maintained through collusion. The later recall of events could have been fed to the sisters by family members. In this version, the daybook is an honest record of an observer who was deceived, and the missing city file is irrelevant because it contained only what the daybook already says. What fits? Every community has hoaxes. The Second Great Awakening produced its share of religious frauds and medical showmen. A family under financial strain might accept gifts. A town might prefer not to declare neighbors dishonest and let the matter decay into legend. What does not fit? The labor. 2 years of turning, feeding, and washing require relentless effort that no gift basket covers. The Herricks refused offers to exhibit the girls and turned away a showman's money. Visitors were restricted, not welcomed. 2 senior physicians corroborated basic findings, and the recall of private details, including the borrowed linen at the mill, points to information not easily fed by accident if visitors were scarce. The hoax theory is easy to say and hard to sustain when one reads the drudgery in Tate's notes. Theory 6. Familial metabolic or genetic hypersomnia. There are rare conditions that produce profound sleepiness, such as Klein-Levin syndrome, which can cause prolonged episodes of hypersomnia with changes in behavior. Could a familial variant have struck both sisters? What fits? A shared vulnerability might explain simultaneous onset. What does not fit? Klein-Levin syndrome typically presents in adolescence, with episodes that last days or weeks, not uninterrupted years, and with behavioral changes absent here. The Herrick sisters were persistently unresponsive, not intermittently somnolent. No pattern of recurring episodes is recorded. The match is poor. Theory 7. Theological sign. For the revival-minded clergy, the matter was simple. God sent a sign. He withdrew 2 vessels from the stream of days, allowed the town to examine itself, and returned the sisters when the lesson had been learned. Their knowledge of events was either a grace granted to them in their sleep, or a nudge to the conscience of a people prone to pride. What fits? The moral economy of the time. the human need to turn unaccountable events into purposeful stories. The way the sisters' recovery allowed sermons to end on hope instead of terror. What does not fit? The fact that other towns with equal piety suffered equal strangeness without the same moral outcomes. The way recovery tracked the slow work of the house more than the temperature of local repentance. Theological readings comfort. They do not explain. Theory 8. Care explained the miracle. There is a more modest reading that gives credit where it is due. The sisters lived because the house became a hospital. The mother turned them. The father rigged tables. A neighbor girl kept flies at bay. The physician refused dangerous interventions and recorded what was true. In this version, the miracle is less about diagnosis than about stamina. The later memory for events is less about visions than about the human mind's stubborn habit of listening, even when the body lies still. What fits? Every line of Dr. Tate's day book. The absence of bed sores, the steady pulse, the lack of infection, the return to strength once the sleep lifted, the specificity of remembered details that could have been heard in the kitchen or through the wall. What does not fit? Simultaneity remains a thorn. The 2-year duration remains extraordinary. Humility is not as satisfying as a headline, and yet it may be the truest shape available. Fact versus folklore. What can be defended? In autumn 1821, Mary and Eliza Herrick entered a prolonged unresponsive state. Dr. Elijah Tate recorded steady pulse, stable respiration, warm skin, lack of reflexive response to minor stimuli, and the sisters' preservation through attentive care. 2 senior physicians observed and did not accuse the family of fraud. The sisters slowly regained movement and speech after more than 2 years. Upon waking, they described local events from the period of their sleep, with details that at least some neighbors confirmed. Tate compiled a case file for the Pennsylvania Medical College. In 1894, the college's library burned. After that fire, the Herrick file was no longer in the archive. What belongs to rumor or inference? The exact content of the missing file, beyond what the daybook suggests. The claim that the sisters' memory included facts no one in the household could have known. Some details do appear specific. Others could be explained by conversations in the house. The idea that a mesmerist ever successfully worked on the sisters. Tate blocked such attempts. The notion that the family sought money or welcomes crowds. The weight of evidence points the other way. Why the file vanished? Here the theories multiply again. Accident: the file burned with the shelves. Paper is mortal. Fires do not respect curiosity. Removal: a lecturer or collector borrowed the case before the fire, fascinated by trance accounts, and never returned it. Cases involving unusual states were sought after by both skeptics and enthusiasts. Embarrassment: a later faculty member, eager to purge the library of what he saw as credulous relics, quietly destroyed such files. This is conjecture, but such purges occurred in other institutions. Misplacement: in the chaos after the fire, surviving cases were reboxed. The Herrick file could be misfiled under a generic label and sit today in an uncatalogued bundle in a university basement. Each possibility is plausible. None can be proved. The absence does a familiar kind of work in stories like this. It magnifies uncertainty and invites our preferred explanations to fill the space where paper should be. Undermining certainty. There is a temptation to pick a theory and defend it until it shines. The record resists that shine. The sisters' condition fits parts of several medical frameworks and satisfies none. Their memory upon waking is at once extraordinary and explainable. Their care was both ordinary and heroic. The file is both present in the shape of the daybook and absent in the place it ought to be. The records called it somnolence. The locals whispered something else entirely, which leaves us here with a sleeping state sustained by a household, with a town that tried to turn the mystery into a mirror for its own beliefs, and with a file whose disappearance turned a medical case into folklore. The safest conclusion honors the care and admits the strangeness. The bravest conclusion admits that we still do not know how long a human mind can listen and remember while the body refuses to rise. What happens to a miracle when it grows old? In Lancaster County, it becomes a habit of speaking softly near a certain farmhouse in a story that families take down from a high shelf, only when the night is long, and there is time to pass something on without interruption. After Mary and Eliza Herrick opened their eyes and turned their faces toward familiar voices, life did not spring back into shape like a board released from a bend. It settled, slowly. The sisters learned to walk again over the same floorboards they had been carried across. The mother relearned sleep, without an ear open for the smallest change in breathing. The father's shoulder straightened, not at once, but one chore at a time. The doctor closed his daybook on the case and opened it on others, because people continue to fall ill and call for him in every season. The town, which had spent 2 years debating whether the sisters were a sign or a diagnosis, found new topics for its disputes. Outwardly, everything returned to ordinary. Inwardly, the case did not finish itself so easily. It left marks on 3 kinds of memory. The first is the family's own memory. You can see its outline in the small choices that are never recorded in ledgers. A chair placed between 2 bedroom doors, even after it is no longer needed. A habit of counting breaths that the mother cannot entirely relinquish. A frown line that softens only when the sisters speak from across the room. When people asked, gently, after several years had passed, whether the girls remembered anything of that long sleep, they answered in a way that displeased everyone who hoped for grandness. They described not visions but specifics. Rain on the roof. The crack of ice breaking in the yard basin. A certain cup set down a certain way on a table when the mother's hands were chapped, and she did not want the handle to bite her skin. Their memory troubled men who preferred clean categories, because it was both ordinary and impossible at once. The second memory is the town's, which is to say the public memory that turns itself into minutes, newspaper notices, and sermons. This memory curates. It decides what belongs on the record and what does not. It writes, singular case, when it could write. We do not know. It chooses brevity when detail would invite argument. It congratulates itself later for being restrained and forgets that restraint is sometimes a disguise for not wanting to be caught with a strong opinion that could be proved wrong. In this memory, the sisters are a paragraph, and then a line, and then a phrase, and then a shrug in a county history compiled by a man who prefers roads to people. The third memory is the archives, and this is the one that should have been our safe harbor. Dr. Tate prepared a careful file. He bound up the measurable facts of an unmeasurable experience. He sent it to the Pennsylvania Medical College, where clerks arranged such packets into order. Professors pulled them to illustrate lectures, and students paged through them to borrow authority. For decades, the Herrick file sat on a shelf among hundreds of other cases. You can picture the room without venturing far from truth oak tables, high windows for light, a chill to the air in winter, a smell of paper and wool. Then, in 1894, fire moved through the stacks. Flames do not sort. They do not respect tidy boxes and careful hands. After the file was gone. Loss-hardened stories. It is one thing to debate an event when a packet you can hold contains the best version of what the most careful man present wrote down. It is another to debate it when that packet has become a rumor. The missing file did a familiar kind of work. It turned a medical puzzle into a mystery that could be bent to fit a cause. In the generation after the fire, 2 currents flowed through American culture that pulled at the Herrick story from opposite banks. One was the maturing of medicine. Words once borrowed from philosophy, humor's vapors, gave way to words borrowed from the laboratory. Microscopes multiplied. Nerve pathways were traced on wax models. Satatonia received its name. Hypnosis shed the word, mesmerism, and entered respectable practice as a tool rather than a show. The other current was the hunger for wonders dressed in modern clothes. Spiritualism rose in parlors up and down the East Coast. Mediums tapped tables. People who ought to have known better suspended their disbelief, at least long enough to send notes to seances in hopes of one more conversation with the dead. Between those currents, the Herrick sisters' long sleep became a scene men on both sides referenced to strengthen their favorite conclusions. The sober physicians pointed to the case to argue that states of consciousness are more various than ordinary language admits, and that awareness can persist without the motions that reassure families. The enthusiasts invoked the sisters when they wanted to convince a parlor that other ways of knowing are possible. Both uses distorted the shape of the original event. The Herrick house was not a stage. It was a room laid open by care. There is a quieter legacy, less dramatic than lectures and trances, and it sits in the small shift the case made in how people in that county thought about sick rooms. The mother's work, turning, feeding, calming, watching, proved what women already knew and what institutions later learned in the hardest way, that survival depends as much on quotidian labor as on enlightened theory. Bedsores do not care about sermons. Infection does not recognize eloquence. Doctors can count pulses, but the outcome rests in the hands that dip the spoon and the hands that change the linen. In later years, when the county built a better almshouse and hired women to tend the chronically ill, you can trace a line, faint but real, back to the time when a farmer's wife kept 2 daughters alive without tools other than patience, lard, camphor, and the will not to sleep too deeply. There is also a literary legacy. In the margins of 2 county histories, published in the latter half of the 19th century, a reader, anonymous except for the pressure of a pencil, scribbled, "Sleeping Sisters," beside a paragraph about unusual weather. The note looks like nothing. It is not a primary document. It is a thumbprint. It tells us that the story lived on, not where scholars go first, but where the county speaks to itself in asides. In the early 20th century, when sleeping sickness cases appeared in hospitals during the worldwide epidemic later, called encephalitis lethargica, physicians flipped through journals, looking for earlier accounts of prolonged unresponsiveness. Somewhere in those searches, a line about a Lancaster County case may have surfaced, supported by a citation to the Pennsylvania Medical College's holdings. A man in a white coat could have ordered the file and been told that the fire had taken it. If he persisted, he might have been directed to the County Historical Society, where a daybook would be brought to his table by a volunteer with ink on her fingers. He would have read the words, "stable respiration, sustained pulse, no decubitus," and realized that what he was handling was not a theory, but a schedule of chores that had saved 2 lives. It is this small beginning of humility in the face of the archive's limits that counts as a legacy too. The disappearance of the file in 1894 has its own sub-legend, a minor chord under the melody. In one version, repeated by men who love neat plots, a lecturer with an appetite for trance stories borrowed the file the year before the fire and kept it on his shelf until his heirs tossed it as old nonsense. In another, told by librarians who have watched purges happen under the banner of modernization, a zealous faculty member decided that the library needed fewer tales from the age of magnetism and consigned a stack of curiosities to a bin. In a third, which librarians prefer because it preserves hope, the file simply went to the wrong box in the chaos after the fire and sits, mislabeled, in a basement that floods every spring, waiting for the one person who will recognize the word Herrick, written on a long envelope in a fading hand. None of these possibilities can be proved. Which one you prefer says something about what you believe institutions do when they are not being watched. In the county itself, the phrase, "sleeping sisters," persisted long after the particulars faded. Mothers used it as a shorthand for hush. "Mind the sleeping sisters," they would say when children ran too loudly past a certain gate, long after the Herricks were gone, and another family mended harness at the same house. A schoolteacher used it once as a metaphor for the children who decided not to recite when called on. The class laughed. Then the teacher, remembering where she was, corrected herself and said one should not make light of affliction. The phrase lived because it was useful. It was a local language for the moment when the normal rules of waking and sleeping break and a household becomes a threshold. As for Mary and Eliza themselves, the record remains deliberately vague, because that is how the family left it. The county marriage rolls do not shout their names in any year, immediately following their waking. That does not mean they did not marry or that they did. It means the Herricks did not choose to make their daughters' futures part of a public story. The same daybook that holds the doctor's account of their sleep holds, months later, a brief note. Both converse sensibly, assist with domestic tasks, and appear in health. The absence of further medical intervention in the book, year after year, is its own kind of legacy. It says, in effect, that the sisters were returned to the town's general account and did not require entry in its special ledger again. There is a temptation, in telling a story like this, to hand the closing paragraph to the neatest theory and let it bow for the audience. The case resists that neatness. It is not a parable. It is a record so thin it must be read with the gentlest fingers, and a refusal to pretend that uncertainty can be pried open farther than the paper allows. The strangeness of the sisters' memory belongs neither solely to sermons nor solely to pamphlets. The strength of their survival belongs neither solely to the physician who counted nor solely to the mother who turned. The missing file belongs neither to accident nor design with the certainty that would let us sleep. What the story offers, instead of triumph, is a mirror. It shows how a rural community under pressure used the tools it had to make meaning: meeting house minutes, tidy daybooks, gestures of charity, gossip, silence. It shows how a physician did the best part of his job, which is to keep watching and keep writing, even when the words do not yet exist. It shows how a mother's unpaid labor can carry two lives across a long, cold bridge when the town stands on the riverbank arguing about whether the bridge is real. It also offers a warning about archives, which are beloved for good reason and more fragile than their brick walls suggest. Fires eat indiscriminately. So do fashions. What one generation labels useful, another labels curious, and curious can slide too easily into expendable when a budget needs balancing or a reputation needs buffing. The absence at the heart of the Herrick case is not unique. It is a common wound in the record of the powerless and the peculiar. The only honest response is to admit the wound, patch what we can with surviving scraps, and refuse to pretend the fabric was never torn. There are ways forward that are less dramatic than finding a missing box and more faithful than inventing heroics. They look like this. A local historian combs the back pages of the county paper and finds a letter to the editor, never printed, but kept in a bundle. A descendant opens a linen chest and discovers a folded note in which a great-grandmother wrote 2 lines about the long sleep, intended for no one but herself, a graduate student, with a taste for archives and patience for microfilm. Notices that the meeting house minutes handwriting changes in the middle of a sentence on a certain date, and wonders what cause led to the break. These are the small lights that can be brought together, not to burn away the dark, but to make it less total. In Lancaster County today, the house where the Herricks lived has been altered, porches added, windows replaced, paint changed. A family of a different name eats at a table where another family once counted breaths. People walking the lane do not step quieter, because few remember why their grandparents did. Yet if you stand there in autumn, when the mist hugs the fields and the church bell measures the morning, and let the noise drop until you can hear only what the place always heard, the creak of wood, the drip at the spring house door, a mother's cup set down, you may feel the past arrange itself around you for a moment, not to frighten, but to insist on being counted. Perhaps the truth still lies hidden in misfiled boxes labeled somnolence, in daybooks folded into family trunks, in meeting house minutes that no one has asked to read in years, in a scrap of letterhead rescued from a fire and tucked into a book as a bookmark by a clerk who did not know what he was saving. Or perhaps it lies only in the persistence of a lane that learned, for 2 long years, how to keep a watch that was not marked by clocks. Either way, the legacy of the sleeping sisters is less a solved riddle than a way of looking careful, patient, and unwilling to turn away from the quiet rooms where history hides, because louder stories ask for our attention. The mist has lifted from the Herrick lane. The bell has fallen silent. 2 sisters who breathed like metronomes for more than 2 years have walked back into the ordinary light. What remains is the echo of physicians' neat lines in a daybook, a community's sermons and silences, a file that should have been safe and was not, and the unsettling fact that memory sometimes survives where waking does not. You have heard the careful measures: sustained pulse, stable respiration, warm skin, no bed sores. You have heard the quiet labors that made survival possible. The spoon at the corner of the mouth, the turning of bodies, the combing of hair, the patient refusal to let fear become cruelty. You have weighed the theories of prolonged catatonia, a post-infectious stupor, a shared conversion under crushing religious pressure, or simply the mind's stubborn listening across a long darkness. You have stood in the doorway as Mary and Eliza named storms and bells and borrowed linen that no one had set down in ink. Now the decision is yours, not to solve the unsolvable, but to say which shape of truth you find most convincing when the paper runs thin and the fire has had its way. One focused question for you: which explanation best fits the Herrick sisters? Medical stupor with preserved hearing, a shared psychological descent and return, or something stranger that our language still cannot quite hold? Share your answer in the comments. Tell us why the details point you there: the threads on the bedpost, the tear that appeared without a cry, the way a mother's routine can look so much like a miracle when written down by a steady hand. If this story stayed with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And tell us where you are listening from. We love hearing from our community of history enthusiasts across towns, counties, and coasts. In our next episode, we will open another door most people would rather keep shut, a New England mill town that swore its children simply wandered off in winter, and the factory ledger that counts boots instead of boys. The pages survived. The names did not. We will read